Are we recording? Recording? Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Lena, Oleg, we don't have to be close to the microphone. Apparently, it's a very high-tech microphone, so we can relax and talk from distance. We don't have to. Um, well, pretty close to the microphone. Apparently, it's a very high-tech microphone, so we can relax and talk from distance. That's my voice. Yes, of course. Am I going to hear my voice all the time? No. Okay, here we go. Well, good evening. Hello, Sagui. Hello. Good evening from Almeria, Spain. Depending on which part of the world you are watching this, I should say good morning or good afternoon. But anyway, in Central Europe is good evening. So it's a pleasure to be here with all our friends, our invited speakers, and the people here in the room. Not many of them, because I think people prefer to use the screens more than to be physically in the place. But anyway, and it's a true pleasure, and I'm very happy. Talking about happiness and well-being, I'm very happy of having contributed to this meeting. It was Oleg Basaluk's idea, and I really appreciate Oleg, your initiative. When you said, would you like to organize this meeting? And I say, yes, yes. I don't know how I will do it, but I say yes. And I couldn't imagine the high level of our speakers when I knew a little bit about Tim Lomas, about Brendan Case, about Make Bartels. For sure, I knew Elena because she is my colleague from many, many years ago. But the three of you, Make, Tim, and Brendan, I really admire your work in the area of well-being and happiness. And I think that we should make our best efforts to make this topic a more widely known topic. It's amazing that everybody is supposed to be interested in happiness and well-being, but as a research topic, it's not so well considered. For example, in our university, in this University of Almeria, some colleagues from the area of psychology said, well, I'm not interested in well-being and happiness, you know, I don't think it's an interesting topic. Pardon? It's not is there anything more interesting for your life and for people's life than having a happy life, to be content, to be anyway, the thing is that as a research topic, we are probably at the beginning. Obviously, with the birth of positive psychology, the whole thing grew up, but we are at the start, we are at the childhood of the topic, of the research topic, in my humble view. So with this meeting, we want to contribute to the progress in the study of well-being and happiness. So look, I'm going to be the moderator of the panel, of the roundtable. Only in some specific cases, I will make some comment or formulate some question, but I prefer to limit myself to the moderator role. The first person that I would like to give the speech is Oleg, because Oleg had the idea. And for those of you who don't know Oleg Basaluk, with your permission, Oleg, I'm going to read just a few lines. Oleg is a professor. He's a doctor of philosophical sciences. His research interests include interdisciplinary studies in the fields of neurophilosophy, philosophy of education, philosophy of the cosmos, and political theory. He is the editor-in-chief of the Philosophy and Cosmology Journal and the director of the Belt and Road Initiative Center for Chinese-European Studies at Guangdong University of Petrochemical Technology, Maoming, Guangdong, China. Oleg, thank you very much for having the first idea of organizing this meeting. It's your turn if you want to say some welcome words.
Okay, thank you. I would like to thank Professor Rafael Pulida and the University of Almeria for their hospitality and for organizing this online discussion. Many thanks to all participants and especially to our speakers. To enter our discussion, I want to remind you that the philosophy and the ideas it promoted were never popular with its contemporaries. Beginning with Socrates and Plato's first lecture, philosophies have been seen as etapas, unclassifiable, of high originality. At the same time, it is an undeniable fact that it is philosophies who have shaped and continue to develop what we habitually refer fundamental knowledge. In the academy, fundamental knowledge were denoted by the verb episteme, know how to do, knowledge resulting from prolonged practice and sustained personal effort. Today, our speakers will show us a modern understanding of the episteme, to know how to do happiness. I admit that some aspects of today's discussion will be difficult to grasp, controversial, perhaps even revolutionary. However, I am certain that our discussion is a contribution to fundamental knowledge. The topic of our discussion is a continuation of the discussions in Plato's Academy. It was in the Academy that the theme of happiness, or rather eudaimonia, was first connected with paideia, pollution, and the loss of the cosmos. The noun eudaimonia and adjective eudaimon are happiness, well-being, outward prosperity, to be happy in the sense of living a good life. The adjective eudaimon literally translates as blazed with the daimon, where daimon is what we understand and will discuss today as genes. In Plato's ideal states Callipolis and Magnesia, happy life, eudaimonia, was a strict harmony between the inner worlds of the citizen, the state, and the cosmos. Happiness was the loss of the cosmos, in accordance with which the state and its citizens develop. I wish a fruitful discussion, which our speakers will generate and Professor Rafael Pulida will manage.
Thank you very much, Oleg. Okay, so we are going to begin with the first of our 4 guest speakers. The idea is that each of them will have roughly 12 minutes. If it's 15, no problem. And at the end of the 4 speakers, they can make questions to each other or they can make any comment. And after that, we will open the possibility for a question from the people who are in the Zoom conference room or here in our room in Almeria. So the first turn is for Tim. But before Tim speaks, I would like to introduce Tim Lomas. Tim, for those who doesn't know him, Tim is a psychology research scientist in the Department of Epidemiology at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And he's part of the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University. Between 2008 and 2012, he undertook his PhD at the University of Westminster with a doctoral thesis on the impact of meditation on mental health. From 2013 to 2020, Tim was a lecturer in positive psychology at the University of East London. Among his extensive academic writing, I would recommend books like Happiness, published by MIT in 2022. I think Happiness, this book by Tim, is in my opinion, the best introductory exploration of how we understand happiness. Another book by Tim is Happiness Lost in Translation, which I found fascinating. It's a kind of, well, not kind, it's a dictionary of words from around the world that describe experiences of happiness for which there are no equivalents in the English language. And there is another book by Tim Lomas, which has been translated into Spanish, The Positive Power of Negative Emotions, in Spanish, El Poder Positivo de las Emociones Negativas. And I hope that one day Tim will come to Almeria or to Spain to talk about his book in Spanish. But Tim, you will have to speak Spanish when you come over here. So we will show you many words related to well-being and happiness in our jargon Spanish, particularly Southern Andalusian Spanish. Very, very funny words, I will tell you. Anyway, Tim, thank you. Thank you very much for having accepted our invitation. It's your turn.
Thanks very much, Rafa and Oleg. Very nice to see everyone. Apologies if I freeze at any point. Internet isn't the best down here. But can you hear me so far?
Yes.
Nice. Okay. So I'm trying to take 10 minutes. I think really to just briefly introduce my work on happiness and well-being, but also want to do that in the context of just presenting a framework for thinking about scholarship on this topic in general. Like Rafa, you just said, I think our inquiries into this topic are really just getting going, especially because, reflecting the views of some of your colleagues, it's not often been given the kind of credibility or the seriousness it deserves in academia, but I think that's gradually changing, and this conference is a nice example of that. But it's a slow-moving picture. So I just want to present a framework that my colleagues and I have been thinking about in terms of the evolution of scholarship around this topic, involving various waves. And before I do that, just to say something about this wave metaphor, it's a way of understanding development and progress in academic fields, but it's a nice metaphor because it's quite organic. It's not to imply that any one wave replaces or supplants or get rid of or negates an earlier wave. They kind of build on each other in an organic fashion. So as you see when I'm talking, you have an initial wave and then a new wave comes along that responds to the earlier wave or addresses something it's missing out on, but the earlier wave will still carry on, it still has energy, and it's not that people belong to a particular wave, they just happen to perhaps be energized by it, like swimmers or surfers in the ocean. And also in terms of the wave metaphor, I think the notion of it taking place in an ocean is also useful, because the wave metaphor I'll outline, I think to a large extent, you could say takes place in a Western ocean. So we'll hear the idea that scholarship has been fairly Western centric, but the Western world is not the only ocean. And there's, of course, deep traditions going back millennia in other regions. And metaphorically, they might constitute their own ocean, as it were. But what's happening now, when we get to what I'll call the fourth wave of global scholarship, I think to an extent with globalization, the oceans are intermingling in really interesting ways. So even if scholarship in the West has been Western centric, I think that's being redressed, and there's much more of a communication and a dialogue and an interaction between scholars of different regions, and the picture is becoming much more global. So with that said, I'll begin by talking about the first wave in modern scholarship, and I think you could say this came into being around the end of the 19th century. So there was an interest in well-being, but you might say an interest in the negative aspects. So here I'm just going to make a real rough distinction between negative aspects of well-being. So that's things that might hinder one's well-being that one wouldn't want. So for example, mental illness, mental disorder. As we'll see, this can also become augmented by a focus on positive aspects of well-being. So desirable things one would want to encourage, facilitate, develop. But I think certainly in the late 19th century, there was really a focus on the negative aspects of well-being. So really conceptualizing and addressing mental illness and mental disorder. So really you see the emergence of psychiatry and psychotherapy, the late 19th century. So really concerned with kind of outlining mental illness and disorder, really trying to ameliorate and treat that. But even as early as the 1920s, you find people starting to recognize that there could also be a focus on more positive phenomena. So one of the earliest was Otto Rank. He was a protege of Freud. He worked with, closely with Freud, but then soon realized we should also pay attention to human potential. So it's important to cure, neuroses, as Freud would call them, but we should also focus on what's good about life, what we should try and work towards. What can human beings accomplish? How can we fulfill our full potential? So from there, he influenced people like Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, who really founded the humanistic psychology movement. So this drew on, really, you mentioned eudaimonia, so classical Greek ideas around eudaimonia, around human potential, deeper forms of flourishing, living one's best life, becoming who we can be. So from the 1940s, 1950s onwards, this wave of humanistic psychology started to take shape. But initially, so now this takes us into our second wave. So obviously the first wave, the focus on the negative, is prospers today. So it carries on, but like I say, from the 20s, 30s, 40s onwards, a second wave that's more focused on positive aspects of well-being starts to gather strength, starts to gather energy. But one of the defining characteristics of this second wave was that it was not about scientific study for its own sake, but it was much more about therapy and therapeutic practice, about helping people. So it's really anchored in the therapeutic domain. So then this provides space for an emergent third wave, which I would say started really in the 1960s and really kind of culminated in positive psychology emerging in the late 1990s. So what distinguished this third wave was a recognition of the value of studying well-being scientifically for its own sake. So even though there's scientific, study involved in humanistic psychology, it was very much about therapy and therapeutic practice. So this third wave really embraced the scientific study of well-being for its own sake. So here you start to see earliest was Hadley Cantrell. He proposed Cantrell's ladder, which was a way of thinking about life evaluation or life satisfaction, where you imagine a 10-rung ladder where 0 is the worst possible life imaginable and 10 is the best possible life, and you try to imagine where you stand at this time. And this is still very widely used. It's in a Gallup World Poll, which has, since 2008 has assessed well-being globally. And the data on Cantrell's ladder in the World Poll is the basis for the World Happiness Report, which since 2012 has ranked nations on that item. So it's very influential. But that was the 1960s. And then from the 70s and 80s, you started to see other measures. So for example, 1985, the satisfaction with life scale, which has been hugely influential, probably the main measure of well-being you might find in the literature. So here we do find well-being scholarship taking on a much more scientific tone for its own sake, not just in association with therapeutic practice. And then it's really culminated, I would say, in the emergence of positive psychology in the late 1990s when Martin Seligman took up the presidency of the American Psychological Association. So this is the third wave, the scientific wave. But as we'll have seen so far, new waves emerge in response to what might be seen as deficiencies or things that are missing in earlier waves. And the third wave of scientific scholarship has been wonderful, and it still is. It's got so much to contribute. But one of the criticisms of this third wave, and indeed, I will say just of psychology and probably even academia in general, is that it's tended to be very Western-centric. And obviously, one obvious example is the fact that most of the publications in the key journals are in English. Rafa mentioned my work on untranslatable words. There's a whole interesting line of inquiry about concepts we have in other languages that we don't have in English. And if we don't have the concept in English, it's not going to be in our scientific studies and in our journals. We're going to overlook it. We're missing out on those insights. Just a very brief digression. The reason I got so interested in cross-cultural psychology was when I was 19, I went to China to teach English for 6 months. When I visited monasteries, I encountered all these words in Sanskrit and Chinese relating to Taoism and Buddhism. that I didn't understand, had no frame of reference for. I came back to the UK to study psychology. And apart from mindfulness was creeping into the textbooks, but that was it. And I realized there was a whole wealth of ideas and concepts and insights and theories about the mind, about well-being in those traditions and in those cultures that was nowhere in my textbooks, in what I was studying. So I really had a sense that there was so much outside of our horizons that we weren't looking at in psychology. So, I think for a long time I had this deep appreciation that the psychology of well-being that we're developing, it's good. It's not that it's wrong, it's just it's incomplete and it's partial. There's lots that we're missing out on. And this has been a critique of, as I say, psychology more generally. There was a famous paper came out in 2010 by Joe Henrik and colleagues saying most people are not weird. I'm sure people might know this acronym by now. Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Making the point that the vast majority of work in top psychology journals is both on people in societies that are weird, so participants, mostly in places like the United States and Western Europe, but also, perhaps even more significantly, the scholars themselves driving this work, they're also in weird contexts. So the words and the concepts and the ideas they're using to study well-being are also Western-centric. But, this paper was very prominent in 2010, and since then, there's been increasing efforts to redress this, partly by scholars in the West engaging with other cultures and collaborating with scholars, but also just giving a greater voice to people in other cultures. So perhaps indigenous scholars in Australia, for example, we need to hear what they're saying. We need to give them a platform. So it's been notable that several of the recent conferences I've been to have made a real effort to bring people like that, to make sure their voice is heard. So in response to this critique of the Western-centric nature of this wellbeing scholarship, I think we're seeing a new fourth wave of global scholarship emerging. And I think this is really just starting to unfold, gather strength, gather energies now. So it's all quite new. As I say, I think scholarship on wellbeing in general is just beginning, but especially in terms of taking on this more cross-cultural and global dimension. So Rafa mentioned very kindly, I'm glad you like the book, Rafa, my book on happiness. So, within this, there's various things I try to do, but one of the things I try to emphasize is that it's very provisional. This is just my understanding of the latest literature, but that literature is partial, it's incomplete, it's mainly based on a, Western scholarship. So, for example, in one of the chapters, I have a taxonomy of different types of happiness. I don't have time to go into that now, but I have, I think, 16 different forms. It becomes quite granular, different types of happiness. But I make the point that there could be others that are worth identifying and conceptualizing and researching, but that this was the best I could do with the work that's been published so far. But it's a work in progress, so we should try to, I think, increase our efforts to engage in cross-cultural scholarship. And this is the fourth wave, which I think is taking place. And then just very briefly, I was also going to suggest looking ahead to the future. I know some of us here have an interest in, let's call it, cosmic themes. So I suggested, even as much as I like it's so important to extend our scholarship cross-culturally and globally, it's still very human-centric. And I just think the next phase of scholarship really should be thinking about non-human forms, like obviously the well-being of animals, Earth as a whole, but even other interesting life forms like artificial intelligence. What do we do with artificial intelligence? Is it conscious? Is it sentient? What if it can be? How do we engage with it? What responsibilities does that confer upon us? What kinds of research and scholarship should we engage into to think about the nature of artificial intelligence, how we engage with it? Then obviously existentially engaging with issues around climate change, the health and well-being of the planet. From an enlightened self-interest perspective, we need the planet to be doing well for us to do well. We can't be well if the planet isn't well, but also morally for its own sake. So I think I would call this the future fifth wave of scholarship, really thinking in a much more cosmic sense in terms of not just human beings, but just all life. And I think, for its own sake and also for its relevance and impact upon our own well-being. So that's just a real brief snapshot of what I think has been some of the main trends in wellbeing scholarship. So anyway, I hope that was okay. I'll wrap up there.
Oh, yes. It's okay. Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Okay, our next guest speaker is Meike Bartels. And I don't know if it's ready, the PowerPoint, Adrian? Adrian, are you ready with the PowerPoint, Adrian?
I
Yes?
can also share it myself. What's easier?
But let me say something about Meike, which was a huge discovery for me because I didn't know anything about her until just a couple of months ago. And Meike is a university research chair professor in genetics and well-being at the Department of Biological Psychology, Vrije Universiteit, Amsterdam. After an internship at the Queensland Institute of Medical Research in Brisbane, Australia, Meike graduated in psychology from the Vrije Universiteit. Her master's degree was in physiological psychology with a special focus on behavior genetics. Meike has published over 350 papers in peer-reviewed journals, including the first molecular genetic evidence for well-being, published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, and the first genomic variant for well-being, published in Nature Genetics. Based on her research into the causes of differences in well-being, Meike envisions a shift in paradigm from a well-being society for only some to a society based on well-being for all. Maybe she will elaborate a little bit on this in the next minutes. Meike, I know you are a researcher, very busy, traveling all over the world, and I know that your time is a treasure. It's a jewel. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be here. Please, Meike, it's your turn.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Lovely to be here. If you go to the next slide, one more. Next slide, please. Well, I think to start here, I think my talk is a wonderful follow-up to what Tim just described, because Tim and his wonderful work into what is well-being and how to measure it and all these different concepts all around the world, I can only completely agree with him that it's only Western oriented, very limited, and well. For the fun of it, I'm going to even make it more simple because I'm working in the field of genetics, and in the field of genetics, we need large samples. So what we tend to do in our studies is to just pile everything together to get huge samples with any measure of well-being. It could be hedonic, it could be eudaimonic. In practice, actually, it means that it's mainly measures in the hedonic part of well-being. Because not many studies, as Tim also indicated, even not in the Western world, are focusing on eudaimonic well-being, except, of course, for the wonderful flourishing program that Tim and Brandon are part of. It's not by just that we just throw everything together. It's based on also research we did, given that we are interested in the differences between people, genetic differences, environmental differences. We showed in several of our studies that the genetic underlying of well-being is actually similar for hedonic and eudaimonic measures of well-being. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the society, the well-being society, what we see for well-being is that our world, especially also the Western world, is that we do everything, we tick all the boxes, and the aim in the end is to become happy. We have the World Happiness Report that Tim also mentioned, where they report the average well-being of a country, and several countries are currently using that to say, well, this is the well-being we want to end up with our population. So putting well-being at the end. To give a couple of examples, next slide, please. We tend to focus a lot on education, and we see education as one of the ways to become happy. And especially highly educated people become happy. There's also always this direction of causation that's then assumed. So education comes first and happiness follows. as we describe in our well-being society. Well, if you could go to the next slide. There have been many studies on education and well-being, but this is just a recent one of our group, where we looked really at the causal effects of education on well-being. You don't have to look at all the details in the pictures. The only thing you have to look at is at the middle line that is at 0. And as you can see, all the colored lines are actually crossing the 0 at some point, meaning that there's no significant evidence that there is a causal relationship from education to well-being. That doesn't mean it's not associated, because you can imagine that there are several factors that are related to education that are also related to well-being, also at the genetic level. But the causal way of a well-being society where education would lead to a higher level of well-being is not supported by current very large data sets. Then to the next slide, please. Another thing we tend to do in the field of well-being is comparing groups. And I think we miss a lot of things by not measuring other cultures, by only using Western data, but also by keeping focus on group differences between people. Next slide, please. To give you a simple example of socioeconomic status and money, there are many studies focusing on, are people with more money on average happier than people with less money? Are people that are healthier on average happier than people that are unhealthy? And I think we completely miss the picture if we only look at mean levels. So to the next slide, please. If we look at the relationships between income and life satisfaction, there again, there is no linear relationship. There is no causal relationship. And it really depends at what part of the population you are to see how strong this association is. So there's no causal reflection from money to well-being, and also no group differences. So if you could go to the next slide. So these group differences are actually missing the point, because if you go to the next slide, this is the reality we live in. Often in many studies, the within group differences are way larger than the between group differences. So by comparing groups and focusing on the mean levels, we don't get to the answer of what well-being is and where these differences come from. Next slide, please. So what I propose and what I would like to explain to you is that we should focus on the differences between people and not on the mean levels. And if you look at these differences and go to the next slide, it completely fits what Tim said about the Cantrell ladder. This is actually the Cantrell ladder. If you use it in a large population, people can rate their lives from 0 to 10. 10 is the best life you can imagine. 0 is the worst life. And if you do that in a general population in a Western country, this is more or less what you see. Many people score somewhere in the middle, between 6 and 7. Some people score lower, and the red line is the clinical border between mental health and mental illness. And some people score very high. Well, my aim would be, if we look at well-being, and I really loved what Raphael said at the beginning, well-being should be the center of everything. Because if we study well-being in the right way, if we appreciate and embrace the individual differences between people, what we could do in the end is, if you go to the next slide, shift the whole population to the better part. And what we have to realize here, again, is if we go to the next slide, that there will be no one-size-fits-all approach. So our aim should be to make as many people happy as possible, because well-being should be the starting point. So well-being should be the main aim of countries and not the outcome of many things. But everybody's different. So it should be based on a non-one-size-fits-all approaches. And why are people different? That is then, of course, the main clue of me claiming that differences are important. And that's because we have genetic differences and we have environmental differences. So we have this innate drive to be happy, but my happiness is not the same as your happiness. So we should study individual level data and individual level changes to understand where well-being comes from and how we can actually magnify well-being for people. And then to the next slide. So that's where we need to go. We need to put well-being in the center. So I completely agree with Raphael. And if we do that, please go on to the next slide. Well-being can even be the catalyst to many changes in the world. If we look at all the challenges that we face all around the world, We need happy people. We need people that know who they are. We need people that use their full potential. And I think that we can achieve that if we change our society to a society based on well-being, where well-being is the center point and the rest will follow. And I will leave it at that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meike, on a very nice visual support of your words. Thank you. Okay, our next speaker is Brendan Case. Brendan is the Associate Director for Research of the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University. A Christian theologian by training, Brendan's research ranges across and integrates scholarship in the theology, philosophy, history, and the social sciences, with the aim of developing thick, historically textured accounts of human nature and human flourishing. Brendan is the author of The Accountable Animal, Justice, Justification, and Judgment, and co-author of List of the Apostles, Paul and His Legacies in Earliest Christianity. Brendan, again, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you here, and it's your turn. Microphone, Brendan.
You think I'd be used to that by now. Thanks so much for the kind invitation. Am I still? Okay. Now can you hear me? Are we good? Okay. Sorry. Rafa, thank you so much for the kind invitation. Oleg, thank you as well for your good offices and organizing. It's lovely to see you both on a screen, if not yet in the flesh. I also, I'll second, Rafa, your regrets that we are not together in Almeria. Today in Boston, bizarrely, it's closer to 39 degrees than 29. So I would happily switch with you if I could. But there is something, I will say, slightly whimsical and delightful about, hovering over the proceedings like a presiding deity or a Cheshire cat. So I can enjoy that remotely and hope that is as amusing to you as it seems to me. So yeah, let me dive in. As Rafa mentioned, I am the Associate Director for Research at the Human Flourishing Program. Our program's mission is to understand and promote human flourishing and to develop systematic approaches to the integration of knowledge across the disciplines, which is that's the second part, especially, is a mouthful, but it basically means finding ways to help the humanities and social sciences and all their diversity work together more skillfully and coherently in pooling their intellectual resources to develop a genuinely adequate picture of what flourishing consists in. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that aspect of our work. That's sort of my bailiwick in the program. Yeah, so let me dive in. The social sciences, of course, are still young. As Tim said, you have I would give you more than a century, but say a century and a half of history behind you. But compared, say, to philosophy and theology, you guys are just getting started. And so the interaction between the social sciences and these older siblings is still tentative, I would say. A broad paradigm for dialogue, however, in at least some specific areas, is in fact now coming into focus, guided by the conviction that, as the philosopher Mark Alfano very nicely put it, riffing on Immanuel Kant's famous line about intuitions and concepts, quote, "Moral philosophy without psychological content is empty, whereas psychological investigation without philosophical insight is blind." Now, where Max Weber had proposed a clean division between the sciences, facts, and the humanities' so-called values, treating them as what Stephen Jay Gould would later call non-overlapping magisteria, Alfano's maxim points to the essential complementarity of the humanities and social sciences' distinctive methods. If humanists make claims about the actual world, they must do so responsibly, with due attention to specialists' empirical inquiry. And conversely, social scientists must recognize that their concepts are rarely pellucid, their measurements are always partial, and their data is never self-interpreting, so that they can frequently profit from the analytical rigor and hermeneutical insight in which the humanities specialize. And I'd like to, in just the next few minutes, explore an instance of each kind of borrowing. So in the first case, the humanities can help guide, direct, and motivate the research of the social sciences. For instance, recent debates over the measurement of well-being have been explicitly, if often imperfectly, influenced by ancient moral philosophy, especially in the eudaimonistic tradition. So John Helliwell is the editor of the UN's World Happiness Report, which you've already heard about in a couple of cases, which is an annual analysis of subjective well-being in 160 countries. For the report, happiness is assessed by measures of self-reported experiences of positive and negative emotion and by life evaluation, assessed by asking respondents where they would place their lives, ranging from best to worst, on Cantrell's ladder. Now, in a very interesting recent essay, Helliwell has drawn on Aristotle explicitly to argue that measures of life evaluation or life satisfaction ought to be given priority over other measures of well-being, such as GDP per capita or even happiness, as a positive emotion, in contemporary policy debates. He argues that the most important tools for measuring well-being are, quote, the evaluations that individuals make of the quality of their own lives. And he goes on to quote the philosopher Julia Annis from her classic Survey of Ancient Ethics as noting that, quote, ancient ethical philosophy gets its grip on the individual at this point of reflection. Am I satisfied with my life as a whole and the way it has developed and promises to develop? This intuition motivates Aristotle's startling insistence, citing Priam's tragic death amid the downfall of Troy at the end of the Iliad, that even a flourishing life cannot be regarded as supremely blessed, Makarios, unless it comes to a good end. For Helliwell, measures of life satisfaction are Aristotelian precisely to the extent that they invite respondents to consider not merely their current or recent mood, but their lives as a whole. Helliwell notes two further senses in which life satisfaction research is broadly Aristotelian. First, he suggests that life satisfaction measures follow Aristotle in allowing, quote, that a good life is likely to combine elements of the viewpoints later identified as Epicurean and Stoic, that is, as involving both external goods and such as pleasant experiences, and internal goods, such as character and virtue. And second, for Helliwell, he notes that Aristotle insisted, quote, that the right answers to questions about the good life require evidence as much as introspection. There are objective facts which come into play. However Aristotelian Helliwell's approach might be an inspiration, though, Aristotle would hardly have approved of mass surveys of life satisfaction as a tool for gauging the flourishing of an individual or a population. After all, Aristotle took it that most people, the many, hoi polloi, mistakenly believed that the good life consists in pleasure. Aristotle is unapologetically elitist in insisting that a flourishing life is characterized most fundamentally by, quote, the active exercise of one's soul's faculties in conformity with virtue, or to put the same point in somewhat different words, in conformity with reason. To his credit, Helliwell is upfront about discounting Aristotle's, quote, emphasis on excellence and purpose. But an account of well-being which brackets the centrality of virtue is not Aristotelian, nor meaningfully eudaimonist in any recognizably classical sense. Indeed, precisely because they accepted the intuitive requirement that the human good must be good for one's life as a whole, and not simply for the passing moment, even the supposedly hedonistic Epicureans had to embrace revisionary accounts of pleasure. For Epicurus, the pleasures which are really pleasant turn out to be the refined pleasures of intellectual engagement and virtuous friendship, which he summarized as a state of being undisturbed in soul, ataraxia. A more eudaimonistic and arguably more adequate approach to assessing well-being would distinguish in a finer grained way among distinct domains between, say, the external goods of health and wealth and the internal goods of character, meaning, and achievement, and would perhaps discount the former in view of the relatively greater importance of the latter. This is precisely what Carol Riff and her many co-authors have proposed to do in distinguishing, as Micah noted, between what they call eudaimonic well-being or challenge thriving and hedonic well-being, which they define as including life satisfaction, positive affect, and the absence of negative affect. Now, Riff takes the former category to assess the dimensions of flourishing which she claims all the ancient eudaimonists gave pride of place, such as, quote, autonomy, personal growth, positive relations with others, or purpose in life. This approach has the advantage of teasing apart two relatively distinct domains of flourishing, which differ significantly both in their demographic distribution and in their effects on other domains, such as physical health. Nonetheless, the absence from Riff's description of eudaimonic well-being of the central concept of classical eudaimonism, namely the virtues, is striking. Neither Aristotle, Zeno, nor Epicurus would have regarded autonomy or purpose in life as intrinsic goods in themselves. Adolf Hitler, after all, enjoyed a high degree of both for much of his public life, but we presumably would not want to say that he was flourishing in that period. Rather, eudaimonists would regard all of those qualities as valuable to the extent that they were shaped by the virtues, paradigmatically of wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. We might thus hypothesize that measures of eudaimonic well-being would be more valuable and more predictive of other well-being outcomes, to the extent that they incorporated not merely the thin character strengths beloved of much recent positive psychology, but rather the more robust excellences of character captured in the classical conception of a virtue. Okay, so enough for the first direction. This is how the humanities might be able to help out the social sciences. But what about borrowing in the opposite direction? What can the social sciences teach the humanities about their own areas of concern and interest? So even as the humanities can provide those concepts without which social scientific intuitions are blind, the social sciences can furnish those intuitions, that is, empirical evidence, apart from which humanistic concepts are empty. For instance, students of religion, both within and without religious communities, naturally take an interest in the effects of various religious practices. For instance, attending corporate worship, communal fellowship and support, the confession of sin, private prayer and scripture reading, and so on, not only on the believer's eternal destiny, but also on her flourishing in the present. For example, Miroslav Volf's recent book, Flourishing, offers a thoughtful treatment of the ways in which a life of faith can become a pathway to flourishing. Volf emphasizes that each of the great world religions, post-axial age religions such as Christianity or Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and so on, quote, teaches that we live our ordinary lives well when we have a purpose that transcends the good of ordinary life and when this purpose regulates care for the goods of ordinary life. World religions then predict that their followers will generally experience not only transcendent or eternal flourishing, but also, quote, ordinary flourishing. This prediction, however, is in deep tension, Volf notes, with the contention of some students of religion, ranging, going back as far, of course, as Marx, that far from upholding the goods of ordinary life, religion poisons everything, as Christopher Hitchens memorably put it. Now, Volf partially concedes this objection. He notes, quote, religions have a genuine and indispensable gift to give, but they often get corrupted. They malfunction, and the gift turns into poison. These malfunctions can produce religious hypocrites or violent zealots, but in each case, Volf cautions, we must remember that abuses do not abrogate a thing's proper use. Abusus non tollit usum. It is, of course, true that religious communities often betray their own teachings and best aspirations, and true as well that religious practices are vulnerable to characteristic damage, the vices to which their virtues leave them exposed. Nonetheless, Volf's discussion of this issue leaves an interesting and important question hanging, namely, how does religious practice affect ordinary flourishing in general, rather than in its ideals and in its deformations? Without a clear answer to this question, Volf hasn't refuted the anti-religious challenge from Marx and Freud down to the new atheists, so much as dodged it. Volf's silence on this point is particularly striking, given that there is a large and growing empirical literature, admittedly mostly from Western contexts, on the relation of religious practice to human flourishing. Volf helpfully distinguishes three domains of flourishing, which I'll just use as a rough schema for the next couple of paragraphs. So he distinguishes among a life that's being led well, a virtuous life, a life that's going well, a prosperous, healthy, productive life, and a life that feels good, a life of subjective well-being. So let's just consider briefly the empirical evidence for how religious practice bears on each of these. First, regarding a life well led, there's a great deal of evidence suggesting that religious belief and practice generally makes participants less prone to delinquency and crime, renders them fairer and more honest, and more generous in their dealings with others. Regarding a life that's going well, data is again abundant, and this is actually an area in which our Tim's and my colleagues at the Human Flourishing Program have published a great deal. So the data is abundant, and the trend is again reasonably clear. Those who attend religious services at least weekly are about 34% less likely to binge drink than those who never attend. Regular attenders are about 50% less likely to divorce, 27% less likely to get depressed, 5 times less likely to commit suicide than non-attenders, and indeed over a period of 16 years, in one a very large longitudinal study, regular attenders are about 33% less likely to die for any reason than never attenders. And finally, there's, again, quite strong evidence that religious participation contributes in various ways to a life that feels good, at least on average. Religious practitioners consistently report higher levels of meaning and purpose in their lives than non-practitioners, as well as higher levels of overall life satisfaction. While questions of causality and directionality are almost always open to dispute, of course, the research on this topic has become increasingly rigorous, employing data over time and principles of causal inference to evaluate the evidence. And of course, I hasten to add that many of these findings would almost certainly generalize across all religions, including primary or pre-axial age religions. Even religious practices which rightly horrify us today might once have been a source of Durkheimian social cohesion. The biblical book of 2 Kings, for instance, recounts how when King Mesha of Moab sacrificed his eldest son on the walls of his besieged city, his troops apparently recovered their courage and flew into a frenzy which turned the tide of the Israelite advance. Moloch worship might not be the best, but it's in religious terms better than nothing, apparently. And it seems very reasonable to think that much of what social scientists or theologians alike study under the rubric of religion is emphatically a natural phenomenon, which unites us to one another by uniting each of us to some conception of divinity or transcendence. What you do with that theologically, or in a tradition-specific way, of course, varies by tradition. Mahayana Buddhists have their own way of thinking about non-dharmic traditions as the skillful means exercised by the Buddha for the sake of drawing lost souls closer to himself. Christian theologians have a whole variety of approaches to thinking about other traditions as preparatory in some sense for the Gospels say. But the point is that this is an area, to my mind, which humanists, including theologians, my fellow travelers, neglect at their peril. There's an awful lot of data that we need to attend to. And in my view, here I'm wrapping up, we have a great deal to learn from each other and a great deal of work to be done, but this is gives you a taste of the kinds of conversations that we're having in the program and elsewhere in the Academy. So thank you for your kind attention. I'll shut up now.
Okay, thank you, Brendan. A lot of stuff on the table. And our last speaker, Elena. Are you ready? Let me tell you something about my dear friend, because basically she's a friend and then a colleague. Elena is a senior lecturer in the Department of Philology at the University of Almería. She graduated at the University of Malaga and completed her PhD at the University of Granada in Spain with a doctoral dissertation about teachers' beliefs on motivation and their behaviors towards this construct in the English class. Elena has spent several research stays in the United Kingdom and the United States. She has a teaching career of 30 years, most of them at the University of Almería, where she served as chair of the Department of English and German Philology. Apart from her many articles and book chapters on topics like teachers' beliefs, motivation, emotions, what I really admire in Elena's work is her natural ability to display some sort of spiritual attitude, so to speak, to life, particularly her ability to apply her experience in the practice of mindfulness to the classroom context. If I have to pick one person at my university who represents the meaning of being happy while doing your job, I would pick Elena. And maybe that's why she is here today. Elena, I'm very lucky for having Elena as a close colleague here. And I thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And it's your turn, Elena.
Okay, thank you very much, Rafa. Thank you very much for this invitation. In fact, I'm very nervous because I am here with very well-known people in this area, in this topic. So I'm just going to talk about something, well, in fact, something I started some years ago, although I changed in one way or another. with respect to it, and I will show it to you today. But some years ago, I started to research and study and research teachers' beliefs, and whether their beliefs are related or were related to their behaviors in a class. Okay, and in fact, I'm teaching future teachers of English, and at least in our country, in Spain, and in Almeria, we check that teachers enter their classes automatically, teaching automatically, not being conscious sometimes or most of times of what we have in our hands, especially concerning to teenagers, secondary education, right? In primary education, probably is not that way, but when talking about secondary education, probably because teachers finish their grades, English philology or biology, any subject, without studying psychology, pedagogy, and all these things, okay? So I was very interested in studying conscious teaching, and today I'm going to start the paper I prepare with some words of, by the way, Tim Lomas, Pawelski, and Van der Wely, who said this year exactly, and I quote, concepts like flourishing, well-being, health, and happiness are of increasing interest across many fields, from psychology and medicine to politics and economics. Okay. And in fact, what I'm going to do is to concentrate today here in the concepts of happiness and well-being in education, okay? And to do so, I will pay attention to important constructs in education, such as neuroscience nowadays, mindfulness, and I will mention the importance of conscious teaching or reflective teaching, as I have already mentioned that I started to investigate some years ago. I want to place emphasis on the concepts of happiness and well-being in education because I strongly believe that a school or a university is not just an institution where students come to receive education. And this is what most teachers, at least in Spain, in secondary education, as I said before, do. It is a place where they learn, grow, make friends, and memories to cherish for a lifetime. In fact, it is a place where they develop a personality, character, values, and beliefs that stay with them throughout their lives. Her research, I introduced a sentence here which is not the right one. Okay, needless to say that the experiences gained in the academic world play a major role in determining a person's success and well-being later in life. So, starting to say some words concerning neuroscience and mindfulness in education, and following Cabrera 2021, I could say that having certain knowledge of the brain and that the primitive brain or our limbic system drives our emotions and instincts is important to develop personally in any field. Having that in mind, it is also important to know that there are two branches in neurobiology, neurophysiology, and neuroanatomy, making reference to the brain structure and the functioning of the structure, respectively, being this last one, the part of neuroscience that teachers should be interested in. According to Bethan, The branch of neuroscience that studies meditative practices is known as contemplative neuroscience. The link between the so ancient contemplative practices and science is contributing to the birth of a modern set of tools that can be applied to our hectic lives and teaching methodologies. From it has come out the mindfulness method in education, according to some findings, with the purpose of learning strategies to learn and perform better and be more motivated and more receptive to learning, which at the same time will be related to happiness and well-being in education, because it at the same time could affect and modify the way we think, act, and feel. In this line, it is also important to mention Langer, who coined the term mindful learning, not related specifically to teaching, but implied that learning without awareness is limited and many times useless. And this is what our teachers here, at least in Spain, don't realize or don't pay attention to, okay? So this researcher Langer in general went a step further when they stated that mindfulness has to do with the capacity to manage the relationship with the environment surrounding somebody, where the inner potential participates without being influenced by the environment, no matter what it might be. This is something, therefore, very relevant in the comprehension of the relationship between human beings and their surroundings. Another important point that is related to mindfulness in is attention regulation, which is a cognitive process which could be connected with three relevant components: alerting, orienting, and conflict monitoring. Alerting has to do with the readiness when we receive a stimulus. Orienting is the choice between the stimuli, and conflict monitoring is related to the solution of the neural conflict concerning with the fact of paying attention to one thing or the contrary. Anxiety or stress are other crucial factors from psychology and neuroscience to understand the way we may feel, the way the body may react to them, and the way we could deal with the body and mental state when talking about them in a general way, and from the perspective of education and foreign language or foreign languages teaching and learning. Taking that into consideration, the stress response that an English as a foreign language student or English as a foreign language students in general may experience is the mental or emotional pressure that is often triggered when we experience something new, unexpected, or that threatens our sense of self, or we feel we have little control over a situation. We all deal with stress differently. Our ability to cope can depend on our genetics, early life events, personality, and social and economic circumstances, according to Mental Health Foundation 2022. If we comprehend the relationship among stress, mindfulness, and learning, we could comprehend, and when I say we, I'm talking about teachers and even students, okay? We could comprehend the link between the cognitive and the emotional system, which is that the two systems are non-related and interrelated because they may influence each other. Feelings, ideas, and cognitive influences are common, and if students understand their mechanisms, they may manage to control their emotional system to escape from or allow a specific physical or mental reaction. For all these things, I'm emphasizing we could say that this is a very important, that it is very important to talk about the relationship between emotion and cognition neural systems to improve our physical and mental well-being and foster learning as a consequence, justifying neuroscience application in education, searching for solutions to many impediments that may affect emotions and mental states during learning and avoid students to be happy in their daily routines in the classroom. Neuroscience is therefore starting to play an important role in education, at least here it should be, studying which are the best situations in which the brain will function better to improve motivation in class, for example, or just students' well-being derived from valuing the treatment of certain behaviors or mental imbalances, such as the absence of drive when treating depression through meditation. Accordingly, it is assumed at the present moment that meditation produces cognitive changes, transformations in the brain, neuroplasticity in only a few weeks of practice and has positive effects on thoughts, emotions, and behavior. As a result, mindfulness and meditation could help a lot to promote well-being in a class. And some researchers affirm that the use of mindfulness in any learning subject, and specifically the foreign language, may help with certain obstacles such as stress or anxiety. Following Nebot 2017, or with learning strategies, metacognitive strategies, problem-solving strategies, etc. Recently, at least in Spain, education has focused on teaching metacognition strategies, which are being taken by teachers from some research works related to neuroscience about how the brain learns, and that may help students improve, if they will know it through their teachers, to improve their learning quality with tools like mindfulness or meditation to cope with potential impediments. Also mentions cognitive, social, and physical demands of day-to-day life in the classroom. And she refers to visible classroom with a strict focus on student achievement, which is very common, or the normal thing in Spain at least, and the invisible classroom, the net of hidden emotional, relational, and neurological factors at work every moment among the faculty and students. Also use the expression invisible classroom that refers to the web of neurological and human connections that create the context for teaching, learning, and living. From these words, we could interpret that students' brain might work in better conditions with a network of connections created around the personal, but working together, for example, or what we could call cooperative learning, where academic performance and success would be shared, supported by all classmates. And this is something very common nowadays, I have to add, among our students that are carrying out their dissertations to finish their master degree, for instance. But it is not common when talking about teachers in their classes, in their daily routine, okay? For this reason, it is recommended to work making a web, and I'm going back, just joining it with cooperative learning, making a web of interconnected relationships among students, for example, for them not to work isolatedly, living apart competition and mockery or ridicule, as in the case of speaking a foreign language specifically, very often other causes of anxiety and stress in students. Another point to bear in mind here is that we can say that mindfulness and positive psychology have also got a close relationship as the potential results of the practice of meditation or mindfulness in general and related to self-compassion, more satisfying relationships and attitude towards life, and particularly towards the process of learning, better empathy, or more proactive attitude. To finish with, the recognition of the positive effect generated by mindfulness activities and the creation of a conscious environment is vital for the teaching well to take then into account as didactic proposals and use them regularly in the classroom. The teaching and learning paradigm would benefit greatly from the implementation of activities with a meditative, playful, and conscious nature to ensure that the students do not get lost in the journey of learning and grow at an academic and personal level. Together with this, we must also add that it definitely could help that teachers improve their recognition of the students' learning process and update their teaching styles, becoming more conscious people and teachers to foster students' happiness. I completely agree with the investigation that state that we teach who we are, and therefore it is our duty as teachers to be reflective, analyze our students, and look towards us to offer them the best experience, since it is very relevant for their present and future learning and life. Thank you very much. I finished.
Thank you, Elena. Your presentation has reminded me of something that Brendan said in one of his speeches about the character education, the education of the character of the. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Love you. Well, I would like to make a very brief reflection for 2 or 3 minutes. So I give a bit of time for make some comments or questions for the our guests in the Zoom room or here in the physical room. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 2 or 3 minutes. And so if you want to make a question, you have 2 or 3 minutes to write your question. You know what? I think I know why well-being and happiness is a topic not so central in the academic field. It's because it's a hell of complex. I mean, it's so complex. The complexity of happiness and well-being is incredible. When Tim talked about a flexible map with all these dimensions of happiness and levels and so many ingredients in this flexible map. By the way, I love the concept of scalable granularity. Each part of the model, each part of the flexible map to inquire into happiness, each little part can be fine-grained in more specific and more detail, and which means that it doesn't matter what part of the well-being happiness issue you are making research, you can use your zoom or your microscope to specify even more fine details in the picture. And so the first reason for well-being and happiness not occupying a central position in the academy is the complexity. Okay, when we think about complexity in science, we used to think about quantum mechanics or things like that. But happiness is probably at least as complex as quantum mechanics. And the second reason, in my view, the second reason why happiness and well-being is not the central thing in the academic work is its closeness to us. I mean, happiness, well-being, even health as a concept, these things are so close to each of us as human beings that it's very difficult to create a sort of objective distance in order to make science about it. Probably some of you remember one of our emails in which I said, talking about the personal equation of the researcher, to what extent our experience, our personal experience, because before, firstly, we are human beings, and then we are members of the academy or researchers or whatever. So as human beings, we have our personal history, our personal experience of happiness and well-being. To what extent this personal experience has made some influence in our approach to this topic. In any case, I think that we have to practice humility, and we need a very open mind if we want to progress in the study of happiness. In my view, each of our speakers, in some way or another, they have demonstrated in their research careers to have this humility. For example, the wish to approach different fields and to learn from different fields: literature, history, philosophy, sociology, obviously genetics, psychology. And this is the attitude that we need: humility and open mind. Otherwise, we are not going to progress. I don't know what the fourth wave is going to provide us with. I don't know if the fourth wave will really produce a global, multicultural approach, non-Westernized theory about happiness. I don't know. And obviously, I don't know anything about the fifth wave, which is only part of my imagination. But in any case, to progress in the third, the fourth, or the future fifth wave in the study of happiness, I think, and I guess that you will agree, we need a lot of humility, and we need a lot of open mind. Okay, that's my glorious minute. And so if anybody wants to make a question, between the four of you, if one of the four guest speakers wants to make a question, or direct question, or some comment or whatever, you are most welcome. It's your time now. Or we can pass to the audience and people who want to say something here.
Well, while we're waiting for the question, I can respond on all the wonderful talks. Thank you all for giving me a learning experience. That's the beauty of being from all different backgrounds and fields. And I just want to confirm that I agree with all that has been said, and that although genetics sometimes sounds complicated to people, that's actually the basis, because the humility and the acceptance that we are all different makes your life really better. I think if you want a well-being journey, it starts by appreciating and embracing the differences between people. And as soon as we can like build very huge diversity programs like we do, and we have very strong political streams, and everybody's talking to about diversity. But the main thing you should always realize is that anyone you interact with during the day is different than you are, and partly based on a different genotype. So if you start respecting that and actually seeing the beauty of it, life becomes way better. So that also reflects how my science and my private life comes together, is that I think I became way more happy by accepting and actually seeing and embracing and enjoying all the differences. And academic life gives you the opportunity to meet many people around the world. And my biggest pleasure always is in like meeting different people. And not because they do different research, just because they are different. So that's my tiny contribution to that, how to make the world a better place.
Thank you, Meike. Thank you. You know, this thing of negative and positive side for years has made me, I disagree with the whole idea of there is a negative experience, and then when you pass the zero value, you have the positive side. In one of those traditions that Tim mentioned, in the Buddhist tradition, and always, and also in other traditions, in Asian traditions, happiness is the lack of suffering. So there is no positive happiness. Happiness, by definition, is the absence of suffering. And it makes a lot of difference understanding happiness in terms of negative values, 0 and positive, or one parameter, negative, and happiness is the lack or the absence of suffering or negative. Maybe because I have some Buddhistic background, I agree with this view. In my personal experience, the less suffering, the happier I am. I'm not looking forward positive things in my life. I am happy when the suffering side goes down. See what I mean? But I don't know how to translate this into a research project in a Western context like ours, in Spain, for example. Because I think that most people, 99% people, understand happiness in terms of getting something, not conforming or not being happy with not having suffering. No, apart from not having suffering, I need something positive. And I'm quite happy with not having suffering. And it makes a difference, these two perspectives. I would like to know your opinion about this.
Hi, thanks, Rafa. That's a really interesting point. I think generally I agree with you about the nature of these labels, positive and negative, because they can be tricky and contentious. But just firstly, I would say, just in terms of Buddhism, I do think even in Buddhism there is an encouragement of qualities one might consider positive, and their ideal is not merely an absence of suffering. There's a really interesting what's the word, partnership, you might say, between mindfulness and a practice of loving kindness. So in the Buddhist center where I did my PhD, in fact, they found it was really important to combine both of these practices, because initially I think there had been a strong focus on mindfulness, perhaps as a route to alleviating suffering, encouraging people to detach from their emotions, and you could see that as kind of emotionally neutral, as it were. But I think in their experience, it had a tendency to take on this kind of cold, clinical, detached quality. And they felt it was important to actually imbue mindfulness with this warmer emotional tone. So they ended up alternating between two practices, one for mindfulness and one was loving kindness meditation. So the metta bhavana, which is partly about developing these feelings of loving kindness for other people and oneself, but then also to kind of imbue one's mindfulness with these positive qualities. So I think on the whole, you're right. Buddhism is centrally about trying to, reduce suffering primarily through, trying to become somewhat kind of non-attached, you might say. But I think there's still a place for emotions and qualities one could traditionally consider positive. Loving kindness, it's positive in many ways. It's positive in valence. It feels warm, it feels pleasant. It's perhaps positive in terms of utility, in terms of its outcome. Perhaps it's positive morally as well. And the reason I'm mentioning these different types of positive is because I think this takes us into some interesting territory when we're thinking about positive and negative. So I don't know if you knew of this work, but some colleagues and I developed this notion of second wave positive psychology. And not to get too complicated, this is a different wave structure from the one I was talking about. This is one that's just internal to positive psychology. So it's not really part of this 4 or 5 wave framework I was talking about earlier. It's more in the context of positive psychology. This was our recognition or our attempt to wrestle with the progress just within positive psychology, because as we saw it, the field emerged out of a critique with traditional psychology as being focused on the negative, which is true. Psychology tends to be focused on studying, ameliorating, addressing negative phenomena, so to speak, apart from exceptions like humanistic psychologists. So in that context, Seligman and his colleagues thought we really need to pay attention to positive phenomena. And I think that was a very valuable and important move. Like, it made space to take these topics like happiness seriously. And then, so it meant that positive psychology defined itself by looking at the positive. And it basically, that meant, you know, recognizing or categorizing or assigning various qualities, processes, traits, etc. as positive. And then thinking, well, we should study them, but then also we should, seek them, encourage them, cultivate them, and so on. And I think that was a really good move. But then as the field became established, it created a platform for them to think, okay, we are going to focus on the positive, but we can also start to think critically about what we mean by the positive, because you started to see these interesting nuances emerge. You could call them paradoxes, but they're not really. But the paradox might lie in the fact that something could be positive in one sense and negative in another, which sounds like a paradox, but it's not really. It's just because we're using positive and negative for different things in different ways. So I mentioned, with respect to the practice of loving kindness in Buddhism, there's positive and negative valence. Something could feel pleasant or unpleasant, but there's various other types of ways of construing something as positive or negative in terms of its overall benefit to well-being, for example. So something could be positively valenced. It could feel good, but actually be negative in its impact, its overall impact. So you might really hedonically appreciate some kind of unhealthy food or drink or health risk behavior, and in fact that's going to be counterproductive overall to one's well-being. Conversely, there could be some experiences that might feel negative. They might be negatively valenced, but actually overall they're conducive to flourishing. You think about lots of aspects of personal development, personal growth. They involve going through experiences that are challenging, or even the act of undertaking some sporting endeavor, or training in a sporting context might feel unpleasant in some sense in the moment, but it's helpful to one's overall well-being. So it's positive, it's negatively valenced, but it's positive in other ways. So we created the label of positive psychology, the second wave of positive psychology, to really reflect these nuances. We're still interested in flourishing and well-being, but just to allow space for these nuances where something could be negative in one way and yet positive in another way, and vice versa. Just to mention, we were drawing on the work of Paul Wong. He called it positive psychology 2.0, and we kind of influenced by his work, but kind of just gave it a different label. But it was to recognize the complexities around designating something as positive and negative, and in general, just to make the point that it's kind of hard to make these categorizations categorically. It's always essentially context dependent, and there's lots of ways, lots of nuances to it. So all that is to say, I take your point about positive and negative, and there's just, I think now an interesting line of scholarship that's really delving into those nuances. Like I say, we call it the second wave. It's not that because that's our work, it's more our label for the work that is going on in positive psychology and beyond. There's just trying to look at these different nuances.
Can I react to that comment as well, Rafa? I don't know if you guys hear me. I mean, I know it was we've been on this for a little while, but just I think it's a very interesting point you raised, Rafa. But it does it offers a nice opening for illustrating something which I think is very important to keep in view in these discussions, which is the danger of any sort of generalized comparison, say of East and West, or even of Buddhism and Christianity, say in these settings. So you might start, and this, I mean, very often generalizations provide useful heuristics, say for guiding inquiry, or framing a discussion. But they typically serve best as sort of ladders that you climb up and then kick away behind you. So one way of kicking away this ladder, which if the ladder is the distinction, say between you know, Western thought's emphasis on positively balanced emotions, you know, or the positive end of the spectrum, in contrast to, say, Buddhism's interest in eliminating suffering, you know, and sort of primarily negative characterizations of well-being. So I mentioned, for instance, in my talk just briefly, the fact that the Epicureans, who of all people in the Western tradition you might think of as being deeply invested in positive emotions, positively valent states, high arousal emotions, even, right? That's our the way we use the term Epicurean today has all of those associations. But the Epicureans, actually, their summary term for a choice-worthy life is that it consists in a state of what they call ataraxia in Greek, which just means a state of not suffering. Actually, the verb tarasso in Greek means to be troubled. As you add the alpha privative, you know, to negate it. So ataraxia is a state in which you are not in a condition of being troubled. And there's very strong evidence, actually, that the Epicureans come by this indirectly, actually, by way of early Buddhism. There's a great deal of traffic in the period of classical Greek philosophy between East and West. The great skeptical philosopher Pyrrho actually traveled to what's now Afghanistan with the armies of Alexander the Great. Very likely was quite strongly influenced in his own thinking by early Buddhist texts. It's a wonderful study of this whole period on these terms by the historian Christopher Beckwith, called the Greek Buddha. That's all about Pyrrho's exposure to early Buddhism. Pyrrho's a deep influence on Epicurus and also on early Stoicism. So on the one hand, you have actually, you know, in a way, what looks like the most hedonistic branch of Western thought actually is basically Buddhist in outlook in that respect. You know, that its deep interest is in what we, you know, might call low arousal positive emotions at the limit. And then, as Tim said, I think Buddhism, in a way, even more than Christianity or other Western traditions, is very hard to make generalizations about doctrinally, because there's a much looser structure, frankly, institutionally, you know, in terms of constraining the development of doctrine, and the common teaching is fairly thin, you know. So there are in fact Buddhist traditions which and I'm thinking in particular of traditions in what's called the Chittamatra school, the mind-only school, which is a kind of idealist school within Buddhism, which effectively reintroduced the idea of an enduring self underneath the sort of ephemera of our ordinarily experienced, you know, psychological ego, and characterized that underlying self, you know, as identical with the Buddha nature and as a condition of purest bliss, you know, purest joy. And so, you know, in a way, you have a kind of, in that direction, you have Buddhism sort of evolving in an almost theistic direction, you know, coming back towards the West. So I think it's always good, and this is, you know, to use Tim's idea of scalable granularity. You know, the ideal, right, I think in these settings is to be as textured as you can be, and not to let quick generalizations paper over really interesting divergences both within traditions. We think of the Western tradition as a unified thing, but it's actually wildly heterogeneous, you know, how it thinks about these big questions, and also really interesting connections across traditions. So, you know, there's just a lot more traffic between East and West, even in antiquity, than we tend to credit.
Well, I would like to make
yeah.
Thank you, Brenda. I would like to make a brief comment about some specific word that you have mentioned, ataraxia. And in my comment will serve as a bridge to our colleagues from Ukraine. I would like to listen to them. Ataraxia normally is translated as unperturbability, okay? To have your mind in a state of unperturbable. The word in the Pali language, in the language of the Buddha, the word was atammayata, very similar to ataraxia, atammayata.
Yeah.
And some Buddhist scholars think that was the central concept of the Buddha's discourse, atammayata, but it's not very well known. In other words, the important thing is to keep your mind in an unperturbable state. And I wonder, when you are living in a context like Ukraine nowadays, in a war situation, how can you be happy? How can you keep your mind in an unperturbable state? Or how can you practice some serenity of mind? So I would like to know the view about these topics from a context in a terrible situation like Ukraine today. So please, Paulo or Sergei, I would like, Sergei, we know each other, and I would like to know your views about this.
Good evening, dear colleagues, dear Fel. Thank you for, first of all, I'd like to appreciate the invitation. It was exciting to hear and the presentations of all speakers, and they are quite relevant and interesting for me and for my colleagues from Ukraine. But actually the question about the relation between happiness, well-being, flourishing and the war, I wanted to ask, and you was the first to ask, so it was on the tip of my tongue. Actually, it's a very difficult question, and I don't have answer to this question right now, and that is why it was my question to the experts who now here in our international conference. It's rather a philosophical question. So could we speak about the in another way? Could people be happy, flourishing, and prosper in the conditions of ongoing war? This question, it is not so theoretical for Ukraine now. It's actually a practical question because we need answer for our circumstances, for our situation right now in Ukraine in this context. So is it possible to be happy? Is it possible to grow happiness? Is it possible to have mindfulness in the condition of ongoing war? That's a relevant question for us, and I don't have answer to this question, but I would be happy to hear maybe your thoughts or maybe the research, maybe which could be done or which were done previously by scholars on this topic. So that's it's actually the question, because I don't consider myself as an expert in the topic of happiness, right, and flourishing. But I'd like to hear this, maybe this discussion, this answer, and in following up this discussion to suggest as a possible development of this seminar to consider this topic as for a discussion in the future.
Thank you, Sergei.
Well, yeah.
Tim, yes, sorry.
Sorry, Brendan, do you want to go?
Yes.
I'm sure, but Tim, if you want to lead off, that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, Sergey, yeah, thanks so much for your question, and just a couple of remarks before I say anything else. Like, first of all, my heart goes out to you, and like, everybody, you and your friends and family and colleagues and so on. So I hope you're doing as well as you can be under the circumstances. And I think the second point to mention is I'm very wary of just speculating. I've never been in a war zone, and I'm sitting here, in my basement here, and it feels like it's a safe environment. So I don't want to speak out of turn, and I don't have experience. But I can just try and offer some thoughts based on some of the research we found and some of the ways in which we've tried to think about these concepts. I suppose the first point to mention in terms of, say, differentiating between happiness and well-being and flourishing, I would say from the way we've tried to think about flourishing in our program, it would be very hard and maybe impossible to flourish in a situation like that. And I say that because the way in which we try to define flourishing is to not just be about the person, but also their context. As in, we're trying to say that it may be possible to find experiences of happiness and well-being, even if your circumstances are bad. And so I'll come on to that in a moment. But then the way we try to then develop an idea of flourishing is to make the point that this is a broader concept, and it's about the person and their context. And then a person couldn't be truly flourishing wasn't also doing well, and that would apply to a war zone, but it would also apply to, you know, I'm in the city where I'm at, there's lots of homeless people. I can't be flourishing if I know that people suffering on the street near me. Sorry, I might froze there. You know, I think that can apply to all circumstances, as in the city I'm in, there's lots of homeless people. I can't consider myself to be flourishing if I'm walking past people who are suffering. If there's real hardship in the city where I'm at, you could even make a case, you know, globally with the challenges the environment. Can we really flourish if the environment isn't doing well? So just to say, the way we try to think about flourishing in our program, we've tried to make this idea that it is about the person and their context. So we can't really flourish if our context isn't doing well. So obviously that would apply to, I think, a war zone. But like I said, it's not just about a war zone, and I think it could apply to lots of people's contexts. But then when we think more narrowly about well-being and happiness, the way in which I mentioned in my talk, we're trying to create a taxonomy of different types of happiness. And I think in very difficult circumstances, some of them would be certainly very, very difficult to achieve, but others may be within reach. I'll give you one example. You know, it's often been found that people in challenging situations might have a greater sense of meaning, whether that's from doing something valuable, whether you're helping your community, whether you're serving a greater cause, whether you know, have something to fight for. So, you know, there was interesting studies, for example, in the context of Britain, you know, studies around how children did in the Second World War, for example, and perhaps, you know, to some extent people experienced a greater sense of meaning, perhaps even a sense of solidarity and community, you know, social aspects of well-being. So I think there's definitely some aspects of happiness and well-being that would, of course, be terribly hard to achieve in difficult circumstances. But then even in those difficult circumstances, that might lead perhaps people to feel, like I say, certain elements might be strengthened, whether that's community or identity or meaning. So I would say, as difficult as a situation like that might be, even so, it might strengthen at least certain elements of happiness or well-being. I don't know if that helps, but that's just some thoughts.
Thank you very much. That's a good point. Just a reference to the Second World War, and that's an interesting point to compare, right? Maybe the situation now in Ukraine and in the context of happiness issues, and about the, as you mentioned, the Great Britain situation in the UK, right? Thank you for that.
Sergey, please, could you present yourself? I forgot to tell something about you and your.
Excuse me, dear colleagues. I thought, Rafael, you presented me. My name is Sergey Rudenko. I present Taras Shevchenko National University of Kiev. It's the university in Ukraine, in the capital of Ukraine, Kiev, and I work at the Faculty of Philosophy as a professor of Ukrainian Philosophy and Culture Department. But not only Ukrainian philosophy is my interest, and also I do research in the history of philosophy, including Chinese philosophy, comparative philosophy, and Ukrainian philosophy as well. Thank you for having me, and thank you for invitation. I'm pleased.
Great to meet you, Sergey. That's great to meet you.
Thank you.
Well, I've got here your CV, by the way. Anyway, you have summarized it. But you know, the thing is that when you meet someone like Sergey and you talk to him, suddenly Ukraine and Kiev becomes part of your context. So you are happy here in Almeria because your context is Almeria. If you expand your context to the whole of Spain, maybe you are not so happy if you are aware of things that are happening in other places in Spain. And if you expand beyond the boundaries of your country, your context, including Ukraine in your context, then the whole thing of flourishing becomes more complicated. I think we should tend to consider the context of the planet. And I think ideally, more and more people should consider the planet as his or her context, for the better or the worse. And that's why it's so difficult to be a conscious, happy human being, because you have to take into account so many realities and so many. We are living in a global world. That's a fact. If you don't want to recognize it, you are deceiving yourself. And the wider the context, the more difficult to have or to find that serenity or that ataraxia or that sense of well-being and happiness in your life. But it's worth it. I think it's worth it to grow up by expanding the sense of context in your life. And flourishing is probably the best, or one of the best metaphors we can use to talk about all these things. Yes, we have a question from the audience here, our physical audience. Adrian, can we have a microphone? Well, we have about 5-8 minutes before we should be finishing.
Hi, thank you first of all to all the speakers for the talk today, because it has been very interesting. And I would like to direct maybe this question to Tim, but everybody is welcome to answer if you like. I'm going to pick up from the point that you were making before about the importance of negativity. And I think that society moves toward the rejection of unpleasant experiences. But sometimes this is what we need to learn to overcome difficulties and build resilience. The way from the academia goes on favor of well-being, but society doesn't seem to do this unless they can achieve this happiness or well-being immediately. How can we avoid swimming upstream? That would be the question. It's like, if the academia moves toward one point and the society on the opposite, what can we do?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I do think there can be a real cultural bias and even pressure towards positivity. There was a writer who we found very, helpful and influential, Barbara Ehrenreich, and she wrote this book, Smile or Die, which was really about just a pressure, particularly in a North American context, to be cheerful and happy. And it was interesting. She traced the long roots of that back to movements in the early 20th century, even the 19th century, even back to the founding of the modern founding of America, as it were. So there can be this this cultural pressure. I suppose if there was a way to kind of resist it and to resist going with that stream, it's the fact that I think most people would intuitively recognize it as something that's not ideal. This pressure to always smile, even if you're not feeling cheerful. And I think to the extent that people can be, I guess, kind and open and honest with each other, if someone asks how someone else is doing and they say they're not feeling okay, that can often be, that person can reach out and they can have a compassionate and meaningful exchange. So I think being real with people, I think can be, it can be going against that tide, that stream, but I think can be well received, because people realize that pressure to feel positive can be challenging. And then I think there's a hunger for real meaningful conversations. So I think once people, I guess, have the confidence to engage in that kind of dialogue, and then to, be real and truthful and honest about their feelings, and that can actually make a deeper connection that people do find meaningful and rewarding. I don't know if that helps, but it strikes me that, like I say, even amidst this pressure that one might experience to be positive, on a human level, most people recognize that pressure can be challenging and would want to themselves resist it. So I think the more people do that, the more it can be helpful in general and kind of changing the cultural conversation.
Thank you, Tim. I would like to make another question, if that's okay. This one is for Mike.
Make it.
Mike.
Mhm.
So some people can naturally produce more serotonin or hormones that make them have more positive approach to life. Other ones have exactly the opposite. How does genetic affect this, and how this knowledge could help individual well-being?
Yeah, so thank you for your interesting question. First of all, the link between serotonin and happiness is not very strong and not replicated. But what you describe is the physiological mechanisms that differ between people. And that's actually the way the genetics work. So you have some people have a genetic predisposition that makes it easier for them to be happy, while others don't have this genetic predisposition. So it's harder for them to be happy. And what you always should realize is that these differences are there. It's similar, for example, with respect to physical condition. If you look at runners, some people have a better physical condition than other people. But if you start training, you can all shift to the better direction. So if you have a group of non-runners and you train them all, they will all become physically more fit. The same for well-being. There is this fundamental genetic differences between people. So some people are easier happy than others. But if you train everybody or put everybody in a better context or make the context better for people, they all can shift to the better feeling of well-being. So it's more the differences between people that are there, and you can shift this population into any direction. Is also with respect to, of course, the negative environment that just had been mentioned, for example, in Ukraine. This difference between people will stay, but they will all shift more to the negative direction due to the, of course, environmental context that became very negative.
Thank you.
Okay, no more questions from the physical audience. I think it's time to finish our meeting. It's been a pleasure to share this couple of hours with you, with all of you. And I hope that in the future we can keep our contact. I hope that we will include each other in our respective contexts. And Almeria will be your house, as we say in Spanish. This is your house. You are most welcome. And I hope that one day we will have a continuation of this meeting in some way or another. Thank you, Meike. Thank you, Tim, Brendan. Thank you very much. Elena, thank you for being here and sharing your views about happiness and well-being. And I wish you all the best. Take care. Sergey, Mikhailo Tasenko, all the best in Ukraine. And take care all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
¿No estaban viendo ellos?
Claro.